Today, we're diving into the story of one of America's most influential families, the Frick family. From Henry Clay, Frick's modest beginnings to an astounding fortune that once controlled 80% of the nation's Coke supply, a sum equivalent to $7 billion today, this dynasty's legacy is filled with drama, violent labor strikes, assassination attempts, and internal family conflicts. But it's not all turmoil. The Fricks also made a lasting impact through philanthropy and art collecting, most notably with the Frick Collection, a world-renowned art museum in New York. In this video, we'll uncover the scandals, controversies, and the enduring heritage that continues to shape the Frick name. Get ready to explore the captivating secrets behind one of the most remarkable families in American history. From new money to old money. Imagine you're standing on a bustling Pittsburgh street in the late 19th century, enveloped by the smell of coal dust and the clang of metal on metal. The city is alive with industry, opportunity, and perhaps a hint of danger, an energy that seems to spark new fortunes overnight. This is the world of Henry Clay Frick. He emerged not from a long line of wealthy aristocrats, but from more modest beginnings, part of a new money wave fueled by industrial booms. With a shrewd eye for business, Frick saw massive potential in coke, crucial for steel production, and used that foothold to build an empire alongside Andrew Carnegie, culminating in what eventually became the legendary Carnegie Steel Company. By 1901, Frick and his partners managed to sell their steel interests for a staggering $480 million, according to numerous historical accounts, including those cited by local Pennsylvania newspapers and the web sources we have. In today's money, that figure equates to an astronomical sum, and the families involved, Frick included, cemented their status among America's wealthiest industrialists. Yet wealth alone wasn't enough to transform new money upstarts into the storied pillars of society we typically label old money. That transition demanded more than an immense fortune. It required philanthropic endeavors, cultural patronage, and strategic marriages, all layered with a sophisticated veneer that would last through generations. But like many industrial barons of the Gilded Age, Frick's legacy is complicated by labor violence, personal scandals, and the taint of brutal strike-breaking that for many overshadowed the grandeur of his philanthropic and cultural contributions. Let's start with how Henry Clay Frick's industrial empire took shape. Born in 1849 in West Overton, Pennsylvania, he grew up in a region that was witnessing the early stages of America's industrial transformation. Coal mines and steel mills proliferated around Pittsburgh, creating jobs but also setting the stage for social strife. Frick, recognizing the essential role of coke in steelmaking, founded the H.C. Frick Coke Company. Thanks to the insatiable hunger of the steel industry, his business exploded in growth. Partnering with Andrew Carnegie became a natural next step. The synergy between Frick's expertise in coke and Carnegie's steel operations was unstoppable. Their combined ventures culminated in controlling huge swaths of American steel production. It's been recorded in various scholarly works that Frick's personal fortune soared to the equivalent of billions in contemporary currency. One set of estimates places it at a level that would rival even modern moguls. The relationship with Carnegie was notoriously turbulent at times, culminating in personal conflicts and public spats. Nevertheless, the profits rolled in, and the Frick name was soon synonymous with the broader Pittsburgh industrial juggernaut that included major rail connections, steel foundries, and an army of workers. Despite, or perhaps because of, the meteoric financial success, Henry Clay Frick sought social acceptance in the eyes of the Eastern elites, particularly those in New York. This, of course, reflected the hallmark transition from new money to old money. Frick recognized that raw wealth alone wouldn't elevate him to the status occupied by families like the Astors or the Vanderbilts. Consequently, he followed a pattern well known among the nouveau riche of the Gilded Age: lavish philanthropy, cultural patronage, and strategic marriages that linked his family tree with other elite lineages. A notable example is how Frick and his daughter Helen navigated the social swirl of the era, forming connections and sometimes alliances akin to what the Medici once did in Renaissance Europe, forging ties across aristocratic and financial lines to secure influence. Newspapers of the day, along with modern historians writing in outlets like the New York Times, have pointed out that such marriages weren't merely about romance, but about cementing social positions, fortifying fortunes, and establishing dynastic continuity. That old-school approach to building a lasting legacy was something the Fricks wholeheartedly embraced. But the Frick family didn't stop at marriage alliances. They poured money into philanthropic projects meant to elevate cultural life and leave a lasting imprint on the communities where they held sway. Henry Clay Frick famously endowed the Frick Collection, a world-class art museum that sits in a grand Fifth Avenue mansion in New York City. Documents from the collection's official website, as well as numerous art history sources, note that the museum houses an extraordinary range of masterpieces, including paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Bellini, and Goya. The original endowment for this art trove was said to be around $15 million, a gigantic sum in its day, and is widely believed to have ballooned to an even more extraordinary total value of around $117 million, as reported by various newspapers and the New York Times. Today, the Frick Collection is not just an art museum, it's a reflection of that Gilded Age aspiration to prove cultural refinement. It stands alongside other philanthropic legacies, such as the Guggenheim Museums, Andrew Mellon's National Gallery, and the philanthropic footprints of the Rockefellers. Indeed, at every turn, we see how philanthropy was used as both a genuine gesture of benevolence and an undeniable social lever. Frick's philanthropy wasn't limited to New York, though. In Pittsburgh, he and his family funded Frick Park, a substantial green space that to this day offers a respite from the city's industrial grid. According to the city of Pittsburgh's official historical records, Frick Park became a testament to Henry Clay Frick's vision for urban development, blending civic duty with a desire to enhance his reputation at home. This philanthropic model of shaping city parks to reflect the benefactor's ideals had earlier roots. Andrew Carnegie built libraries, while families like the Mellons financed institutes and public works. For Frick, it was a way to show gratitude, or at least to appear committed to the city that had made him so wealthy. Local newspaper clippings from the early 20th century describe how the establishment of Frick Park added to Pittsburgh's sense of cultural legitimacy, moving it beyond the steel mills and rail yards. Yet one can't fully explore Frick's story without addressing the darker chapters. Labor strife was rampant in the Gilded Age, fueled by poor working conditions and minuscule wages. While the Carnegies and Fricks of the world grew wealthy, steelworkers toiled under grueling circumstances. The Homestead Strike of 1892 is perhaps the most infamous episode in Frick's career. When workers at the Homestead Steelworks, not far from Pittsburgh, organized for better conditions, Frick responded by employing strikebreakers and Pinkerton agents, igniting a violent conflict that left multiple people dead. Newspapers at the time painted Frick as the face of corporate ruthlessness, and the situation escalated to the point where the anarchist Alexander Berkman attempted to assassinate Frick in his office. Though Frick survived, the negative press was relentless. Critics have argued that no matter how much money the family funneled into art collections and public works, the homestead strike would forever stand as a stain on the Frick name. Indeed, in the eyes of many labor advocates and union historians, it tarnished the philanthropic gloss, aligning Frick's reputation with other infamous controversies of the era. Dohany's teapot. Dome scandal is frequently cited in the same breath to illustrate how the mightiest fortunes could be dogged by epic scandals. Even modern analyses, including books published by prominent university presses, continually revisit Homestead as a flashpoint in American labor history. As the years went on, Henry Clay Frick's children, most notably his daughter Helen Clay Frick, inherited the challenges and responsibilities tied to the family fortune. Helen played a pivotal role in steering the philanthropic and cultural undertakings forward, ensuring that the Frick collection in New York maintained its high standards, and that Pittsburgh projects like Frick Park continued to expand. Reports from the mid-20th century show Helen taking an active interest in preserving her father's legacy, both the philanthropic side and the carefully curated image of refined cultural patronage. She also navigated social waters that linked the Fricks to other prominent American and sometimes European families, echoing the Medici-like strategy of forging alliances. Blogs and genealogical sites have commented extensively on how these marriages and alliances kept the Fricks in a certain social stratum, elevating them from those new money industrialists to a clan with more established, almost aristocratic credentials. Turning to real estate, one can't ignore the grandeur of Frick's various residences. The Fifth Avenue mansion in New York City, which now houses the Frick collection, was once considered a symbol of the unstoppable might of industrial-era wealth. Visitors can still sense the Gilded Age opulence in its architecture, interior decor, and the carefully landscaped gardens. In Pittsburgh, the Frick family estate, known as Clayton, similarly stands as a monument to the lavish tastes of the late 19th century. Historical records from the Frick Pittsburgh website describe Clayton in detail, built in the Victorian style. It was expanded and modernized repeatedly as the Frick fortune grew. Another notable property was Eagle Rock in Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts, which served as a luxurious getaway. Each location became part of the broader Frick narrative, showcasing his desire to rival other wealthy families, like the Cavendishes, with their Chatsworth House in England. Photographs from the early 1900s show the meticulously designed rooms filled with art, and newspapers of the era frequently ran stories praising or criticizing the lavish lifestyles of these industrial princes. Yet not every family that amassed large fortunes managed to preserve them across generations. Take the Goulds, for example, who made millions from railroads, but saw that wealth splinter among heirs, and over time dissipate. For the Fricks, however, careful estate planning and an emphasis on trusts allowed them to maintain both capital and influence. Scholars often draw parallels to the Mellons, another Pittsburgh dynasty known for preserving wealth and establishing powerful philanthropic vehicles. According to multiple financial historians, this dedication to well-structured trusts and foundations is one reason the Frick name remains relevant in philanthropic and cultural circles, while other Gilded Age fortunes have all but vanished. Indeed, the Frick trusts, as they are sometimes referred to, provided a way to administer funds for the Frick collection, the park system in Pittsburgh, and other charitable works. In that sense, the Fricks mirrored families like the Rockefellers, who also set up elaborate foundations to manage philanthropic endeavors for decades to come. Despite these successes, the family's reputation was never fully free of the homestead shadow. A number of journalists and historians have pointed out how the Fricks, much like the Dohenis with Teapot Dome, couldn't quite shed the stigma attached to such a notorious labor conflict. Carnegie had similarly faced public ire, but Frick, who oversaw much of the strike-breaking strategy, bore the brunt of condemnation. Even as philanthropic giving soared, with new museum acquisitions or expansions to Frick Park, critics would remind the public that this was the same Henry Clay Frick who had once locked out workers, sparking a bloody confrontation. The tension between immense cultural contributions and ruthless industrial tactics is a hallmark of Gilded Age figures. So while the public might revel in the splendor of a Bellini painting at the Frick Collection, labor historians and social activists highlight how that splendor was financed, at least in part, by harsh labor practices and union suppression. Balancing those two narratives remains a challenge for anyone who studies or attempts to interpret Frick's life and legacy. Homestead Strike's Hidden Brutality, 1892, and in the small town of Homestead, a crowd of tense steelworkers stands guard near the docks. They've heard rumors that private security forces, no ordinary men, but members of the infamous Pinkerton Agency, are approaching by barge. The workers clutch makeshift weapons, their hearts pounding with worry and resolve. For them, this is more than just a labor dispute. Their wages have been cut, their dignity tested, and their families left vulnerable. If the rumors prove true, this morning could become the bloodiest chapter yet in America's volatile dance between labor and capital. At the epicenter of the storm is Henry Clay Frick, a powerful industrialist who's already made a name for himself alongside Andrew Carnegie in the vast, unstoppable world of steel production. With staggering sums of money on the line, Frick isn't about to let a strike derail his plans. Determined to break the union, he orchestrates a violent crackdown that results in the arrival of around 300 Pinkerton agents, men trained to crush labor uprisings swiftly and decisively. By the time the sun climbs over the horizon, the clash ignites into gunfire. Shots reverberate across the riverbanks. Workers shout orders and curses, and Pinkerton men try to disembark under heavy fire. An hours-long standoff ensues, culminating in a tragic scene that leaves at least 10 workers dead, a number repeated in countless historical accounts. Many suspect the real toll could be higher, hidden in the chaos of battle and overshadowed by hasty burials and incomplete reporting. In the immediate aftermath, Homestead becomes a byword for labor violence and industrial greed. Newspapers nationwide decry the bloodshed, describing how residents could hear gunshots from miles away. With the air thick from gun smoke and the acrid odor of burning coal, the Pinkertons finally surrender, some beaten by furious workers, others half-dazed and wounded. Tensions in the town run high, as entire families crowd the streets, enraged by the spectacle of private armies sent to quell a strike. For many, the idea that a businessman like Frick had effectively commissioned a small militia to enforce his will was a profound betrayal, an emblem of how far the era's robber barons would go to preserve their fortunes. Local conversations bristle with anger, recalling other infamous incidents of labor brutality, even drawing parallels to historical events in which authorities moved merciless against those considered disruptive, reminiscent in spirit, if not in exact context, of the Umayyad response at Karbala. Frick, however, is no stranger to controversy. Already known for his cutthroat business acumen, he's rumored to keep a firm hand on all decisions related to labor disputes. While Andrew Carnegie might be the more public face of the steel empire, Frick is widely seen as the iron fist behind the scenes. Some accounts claim Carnegie had distanced himself from the grim details of Homestead, preferring to remain abroad or otherwise engaged while Frick handled matters. Later, each would attempt to pin blame on the other. Carnegie insisted he never intended such bloody tactics. Frick, on the other hand, dropped hints that he was merely following broader corporate policies. In the flurry of statements and telegrams, one thing remains certain. Henry Clay Frick emerges as the central figure behind the Homestead crackdown, an architect of the strike that bloodied Pittsburgh, as more than one editor would label it in scathing columns. In the months that follow, the public learns just how carefully Frick tried to suppress damaging reports. He's said to have reached out to sympathetic contacts, urging them to frame the strike in a way that diminished the steel company's responsibility. Privately, he blames Carnegie for failing to support a more measured approach, while in some conversations he suggests the workers themselves invited violence by refusing all compromise. To certain onlookers, it bears an uncanny resemblance to the manipulative tactics used by sensationalist publishers who craft stories or bury them to suit their agendas. The parallel with William Randolph Hearst's alleged cover-ups is often drawn. A wealthy figure controlling the narrative to protect his reputation, casting adversaries in the worst possible light, and ensuring the story's spin favors his interests. Contemporary observers of the Homestead crisis note how swiftly certain papers pivot in their reportage once money or favors change hands. Yet for many union members and ordinary Pittsburgh residents, the real story is impossible to hide. The strike site is littered with spent bullets, shattered barges, and blood-stained soil. Families mourn lost husbands, fathers, and sons. Local doctors treat bullet wounds late into the night, while rumors swirl of others who have disappeared or died without formal record. Some union leaders suspect even more fatalities than the official count, pointing to missing workers who never returned home. Could they have been carried off by the river? Or did they succumb to injuries in outlying areas, unrecognized, uncounted? Pinkerton logs and union accounts contain contradictory tallies, fanning suspicions that the tragedy might be even worse than the grim headlines indicate. That question has persisted through the decades, prompting multiple investigations into Pinkerton archives and union papers. Scholars debate the reliability of first-hand reports, noting how each side had reason to skew the numbers. Workers sought to highlight the brutality they faced, while the steel company and its hired agents had every incentive to downplay or dismiss fatalities. In certain diaries preserved by families who lived in Homestead, there are references to bodies quietly carted away under the cover of night, never officially acknowledged in the final toll. To this day, labor historians continue to probe, searching for letters, death certificates, or personal testimonies that might shed light on any uncounted victims. The unreported deaths angle thus remains a haunting possibility, adding an extra layer of sorrow to an already grim saga. In dissecting Frick's role, many have focused on the nature of the Pinkerton agency itself. Since its founding, the group had been involved in various strike-breaking scenarios across the nation. Known for their paramilitary approach, Pinkertons were often employed by big industrialists who preferred the blunt instrument of intimidation over negotiations with unions. But rarely had they encountered such fierce resistance as they did at Homestead. The workers, forewarned of the Pinkertons' arrival, had fortified the riverbank, prepared to repel any incursion. Accounts describe how the barges became floating battlegrounds, with shots piercing the early morning stillness as Pinkertons fired from behind the flimsy shelter of steel plates, while strikers rained bullets and homemade explosives down from the shore. The raw brutality of the conflict evoked comparisons to catastrophic events from different times and places, sometimes stretching to analogies about how ruling powers quell revolts. Though it may be an imperfect parallel, the idea of likening Frick's approach to historical moments of suppression, like the crushing of dissent in distant lands, resonates with observers who see a universal pattern. Those in power protect their interests through uncompromising force, often at the expense of human lives. In that sense, Homestead became a potent symbol, fueling debate in political circles, union halls, and academic gatherings about the ethical and moral limits of capital's authority over labor. Meanwhile, Henry Clay Frick tries to manage the fallout in his personal and public life. Despite being widely viewed as the man responsible for unleashing the Pinkertons, he continues to cultivate an image of a refined, art-loving philanthropist in other arenas. His later endowment of cultural institutions and sponsorship of artistic treasures stands in stark contrast to the violence he helped orchestrate. Some see this philanthropic streak as an effort to polish a tarnished reputation, while others argue Frick genuinely valued the finer things and wanted to share that appreciation with the public. Regardless of motive, the tension between Frick's role as a benefactor of arts and culture and his role in quelling the Homestead strike underscores the complexities of Gilded Age magnates. Their fortunes, built on backbreaking labor, often finance some of the era's most significant cultural contributions. Yet these philanthropic gestures could never fully erase the blood spilled on that grim day in 1892. As the strike drags on, the steelworkers taste a brief triumph in pushing back the Pinkertons, capturing some and forcing them into humiliating retreats. But this victory is short-lived. The state militia is called in not long after, effectively shifting the balance of power back to the steel company. The union's resolve wanes under the weight of extended unemployment, financial hardship, and the realization that public opinion, though shocked by the initial violence, may be swayed by media narratives painting the strikers as unruly mobs. Gradually, strike leaders are blacklisted. Workers who remain find themselves forced to accept even harsher conditions, and the union suffers a crushing blow. Homestead effectively ends in defeat for organized labor, a result that emboldens other industrialists and casts a long shadow over subsequent labor movements. Over time, Andrew Carnegie attempts to distance himself from the violence, insisting that if he'd been present, matters might have been handled differently. This stance provokes skepticism from those who say Carnegie handpicked Frick precisely because of his tough approach to labor. There's talk of private correspondence in which the two men discuss strategies to cut wages and neutralize the union. Whether or not these letters explicitly endorse violence, the overall sentiment suggests a ruthless determination to prioritize profit and control. Carnegie's late-in-life regrets, if genuine, do little to alter historical perception. The Homestead strike is burned into America's collective memory as a turning point, a moment when the industrial machine bared its teeth, leaving behind casualties and searing images of barges, armed guards, and defiant workers. Frick-Carnegie feuds sabotage. Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie had once joined forces to create an empire of unimaginable wealth. By the time the century drew to a close, however, that partnership was in tatters, replaced by an animosity so intense that rumors of secret sabotage soon began circulating. According to one well-known account, Frick himself leaked damaging financial details to undermine Carnegie's future ventures, sparking a covert conflict that some later described as the feud that tore an empire apart. While the pair's falling out is verified by myriad sources, and a fateful 1900 lawsuit actually did unfold behind closed doors, the precise extent of any sabotage remains murky. Certain documents suggest there was more going on than met the eye, hinting at a hidden chess game of cunning leaks and strategic betrayals. Other rumors, more sensational in nature, allege sinister plots of violence, but offer no evidence to back them up. The official lawsuit between Frick and Carnegie in 1900 was conducted in almost total secrecy, a hush-hush proceeding reminiscent of under-the-table political deals from that era. Observers at the time compared it to the maneuverings of other powerful men who'd orchestrated quiet alliances or hidden contracts to secure their fortunes. The whisper went around that this behind-the-scenes legal battle was reminiscent of the sort of collusion once ascribed to a certain railroad titan and his political cronies. For their part, Frick and Carnegie seemed determined to keep the dispute out of the public eye, presumably to spare their reputations further damage. After all, the two men had already drawn significant scrutiny from newspapers and rival industrialists who relished a good scandal. To understand how these titans of industry ended up in a clandestine war of leaked information and legal entanglements, we have to look at the arcs of their respective careers. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant, had built a towering reputation as the face of America's rapidly growing steel industry. He cut an almost archetypal figure, the self-made man who rose from rags to riches, championing efficiency and innovation in steel production to such an extent that by the last decades of the 19th century, he was known as one of the richest individuals in the world. Then came Henry Clay Frick, the maestro of coke production, whose partnership with Carnegie had once seemed like an unstoppable force. Frick's knack for ruthless cost-cutting and business discipline melded with Carnegie's grand visions, propelling their steel operations to unimaginable heights. Yet the synergy that fueled their empire was fragile, built on delicate balances of power, personal pride, and at times clashing views on how to handle strategic decisions. According to recollections later compiled by acquaintances, the two men had profoundly different styles. Carnegie loved public recognition and cultivated a softer image in philanthropic circles, frequently giving speeches about the responsibilities of the wealthy to society. Frick, on the other hand, exuded a more reserved but arguably colder demeanor, caring less about public adoration and more about controlling outcomes. Where Carnegie might publicly advocate for harmony, Frick was comfortable pressing every advantage behind closed doors. Over the course of years, small disagreements escalated into a chasm of resentment. And when certain business crises arose, ones that tested their unity, this resentment flared into outright hostility. It was in the aftermath of those crises that the seeds of sabotage were allegedly planted. According to a widely cited account in a biography covering their relationship, a tipping point arrived when Frick felt personally and professionally betrayed, convinced that Carnegie had hung him out to dry in a major dispute. Some say Frick believed Carnegie publicly distanced himself from controversies to keep his own hands clean, leaving Frick to shoulder the blame. Others surmise that Carnegie, for his part, saw Frick as overly uncompromising and too eager to wield an iron fist rather than seeking measured, cooperative solutions. Whatever the core cause, the final rupture set the stage for a feud that would rock their empire to the core. Historically, giant industrial fortunes often spawned dramatic lawsuits and clandestine battles, but the Frick-Carnegie fallout was particularly explosive, not least because it threatened to jeopardize the future of one of the most significant steel operations in the country. By 1900, both men were wrestling for control of the enterprise's direction, each supported by a coterie of legal advisors, allies in the steel trade, and loyal subordinates within the corporate ranks. Rumors began circulating that Frick, harboring deep bitterness, was slipping certain financial figures, specifically cost overruns, vulnerabilities in supply contracts, and questionable stock maneuvers, to individuals who might use them to sabotage Carnegie's upcoming deals. The question remains, why would Frick risk toppling the entire operation to settle a personal score? Critics argue that an implosion would harm Frick himself, but supporters of the sabotage theory insist that he was cunning enough to leak only those details that would wound Carnegie personally, while leaving Frick's own interests intact. To bolster this narrative, some writers point to references in private letters allegedly written by Frick, in which he complains about Carnegie's duplicity and vows revenge. While the exact text of these letters rarely sees the light of day, and their authenticity has been debated by more cautious historians, the storyline has persisted. Frick, humiliated and enraged, took it upon himself to scuttle specific Carnegie undertakings by revealing sensitive data to well-placed rivals. The same sources claim that Frick's strategy succeeded for a time, undermining Carnegie's negotiations with potential investors or partners. As for the lawsuit that erupted in 1900, it reportedly included allegations that each side withheld critical information, misled shareholders, or otherwise engaged in clandestine activities that threatened the stability of the steel empire. This quiet legal showdown was settled with surprising speed, possibly to prevent the press and the public from learning the full extent of the feud. Some contemporary commentators, writing in a style reminiscent of the day's editorial columns, likened the covert nature of the litigation to a famed political collusion scandal that had exploded in earlier decades. They pointed out that powerful men had a habit of washing their dirty linen discreetly, leveraging backroom deals to ensure the courts wouldn't pry too deeply. Indeed, the hush surrounding the 1900 proceedings suggests that both Frick and Carnegie still had a mutual interest in maintaining some veneer of stability for their steel empire. The public, for its part, had no inkling of how close the enterprise might have come to unraveling from within. There is, however, a note of caution. While the feud between Frick and Carnegie is undoubtedly real, and the lawsuit is well documented, historians are more divided on the sabotage angle. Some accept the plausibility that Frick engaged in behind-the-scenes machinations, but they also note the lack of extensive, detailed evidence. A handful of sensational claims emerged, particularly in fringe publications, alleging violent plots and elaborate conspiracies, but those remain unsubstantiated. One overheated rumor, for instance, claimed that Frick had threatened to orchestrate a campaign of intimidation against certain Carnegie loyalists within the company. But no credible documents verify that rumor. And so, while it's clear the animosity ran deep, the actual reach of Frick's sabotage, if it did occur, remains somewhat veiled. The idea of sabotage, though, resonates with what we know about fractious business partnerships in that era. One might compare it to the tensions within other powerful families or alliances, like the rifts that famously emerged in the Astor clan, where personal vendettas and inheritance battles spilled out into the public sphere. In a separate domain, controversies involving allegations of tax evasion among some of the period's wealthiest figures also provided glimpses into how far magnates would go to protect or enhance their fortunes. Dynastic betrayals weren't unusual. Often these elites projected a unified front in public while secretly maneuvering to protect their own share of the spoils. Frick and Carnegie's story, then, fits into a broader pattern of Gilded Age power struggles, where alliances formed and broke apart with startling speed. Yet there's a distinctive twist to the Frick-Carnegie meltdown. Both men had achieved such a commanding position in steel that their fallout threatened an entire sector of the American economy, not just a single family fortune. Here, the personal truly collided with the national interest, since disruption in steel production could affect railroad expansions, building projects, and even military contracts. The hush-hush lawsuit in 1900, reminiscent of hush money deals and secret political alliances, underscores the high stakes. No one wanted the meltdown to jeopardize America's race toward industrial supremacy. Indeed, from the perspective of politicians eager to maintain a robust steel sector, the prospect of these two titans tearing each other apart must have been alarming. Alexander Berkman's assassination attempt cover-up. Henry Clay Frick was leaning over a desk piled with contracts and ledgers. Suddenly, without the usual announcements or the typical protocols, a stranger burst through the door. Alexander Berkman, an anarchist, fueled by revolutionary fervor. In a flash, shots ring out, a blade flashes. Frick collapses, bleeding profusely. Clerks rush in, someone screams for the police, and within seconds the would-be assassin is subdued. From that moment, chaos envelops the office, and soon, an entire city. Frick's robust persona, the very image of corporate command, lies under threat. Yet astonishingly, he survives. History tells us that Frick was shot and stabbed in this attack, a fact no one disputes. What's less well known, however, is the extent to which he suppressed the seriousness of his injuries in the days and weeks that followed. He'd been left with near-fatal wounds, but you wouldn't know it from his public statements. With the help of loyal associates, Frick managed to conceal just how close he came to death. It's a move reminiscent of how certain political figures, including a well-known president of the United States, discreetly hid major health issues to maintain an image of unimpeachable vigor. In Frick's case, the rationale seemed straightforward enough. Reveal nothing that might weaken his standing in the eyes of powerful allies and dangerous rivals. The bullet Berkman fired, so to speak, was the bullet Frick hid from history, an apt phrase for the secret that, despite the swirling rumors, few fully understood. Alexander Berkman was no random trespasser. Born in the Russian Empire, he came to the United States brimming with a radical ideology shaped by anarchist thinkers. He believed that toppling the power structures exploiting workers required bold, if violent, gestures. Reading about conditions in industrial hubs across America, Berkman became convinced that making an example of someone like Frick would jolt the capitalist system. By 1892, Frick's name carried a particular weight, both revered among some for his business success and bitterly despised by many for his harsh stances against labor. In Berkman's mind, there was no more potent symbol of unchecked corporate power than Frick. So that July, Berkman walked straight into Frick's office, pistol and dagger at the ready, determined to strike a historic blow. To fully grasp why Frick might have downplayed his injuries, it helps to consider the swirl of controversies he was embroiled in at the time. Even without going into detail about the tensions roiling Pittsburgh's industrial scene, one can appreciate how any hint of vulnerability might embolden rivals, unsettle investors, or create openings for subordinates eyeing more influence. At a moment when industrial titans were jockeying to outdo each other, leaders like Frick needed to project near invincibility. Newspapers buzzed with speculation in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, but the official line was that Frick, despite being shot multiple times and stabbed, was already on the mend and ready to oversee business as usual. The truth was less triumphant. Doctors treating him privately noted the precarious nature of his injuries and advised rest. Unofficial accounts suggest he was extremely close to death. Had a bullet taken a slightly different trajectory, the incident might have ended with Frick's funeral rather than a well-maintained corporate facade. But orchestrating a cover-up of such magnitude required more than personal resolve. Frick's circle of loyal confidants had to manage the narrative carefully, ensuring that medical reports were kept quiet and that only the mildest updates trickled out to the press. Employees in the building that day recalled the blood on the floor, the frantic energy as Frick was carried away. Yet in official statements, these harrowing details were softened or omitted. Some onlookers recalled being encouraged to talk less about the severity of the wounds. Perhaps they were told it was for the sake of the company or for the greater good of an industrial empire that could not afford to look weak. Either way, the result was the same. Within a remarkably short time, many people began to assume Frick's injuries were not all that serious. Meanwhile, Berkman faced swift justice. The authorities quickly identified his anarchist leanings, and he became a prime exhibit in the campaign to crack down on radical activities that were gaining momentum in certain corners of the country. Though Berkman believed his attack would spark a broader uprising, or at least a significant wave of sympathy for radical causes, the immediate effect was the opposite. Some labor organizers distanced themselves from him, seeing the assassination attempt as counterproductive violence. As for the trial records, they detail Berkman's justification for his act, highlighting how he viewed himself as a soldier in a moral war against capitalistic oppression. These same records include references to the injuries Frick sustained, though they rarely offer the complete medical specifics that might have emerged if Frick's personal doctors had testified more expansively. Yet that didn't happen. Possibly under direct instructions from Frick, the doctors kept a tight lid on certain details of the bullet wounds and stabbing. The notion of orchestrating a health cover-up has historical precedents. One well-known instance involves a famously robust political figure who was shot during a campaign event yet insisted on giving a speech immediately afterward. He later glossed over the extent of the wound. Scholars have pointed out that powerful individuals often believe that revealing physical fragility risks tarnishing an image painstakingly built over years. Frick's decision aligns neatly with that tradition. If you're seen as the embodiment of strength, physical, financial, and managerial, you can't afford to show weakness. Whether leading a nation or running a massive industrial enterprise, projecting invincibility can be half the battle. Curiously, some have drawn parallels to medieval intrigues like the dramatic conflict involving the Plantagenet monarch Henry II and the Archbishop Thomas Becket, culminating in a notorious murder inside Canterbury Cathedral. Though that historical episode was drastically different in context, the secrecy and subsequent spinning of the story have a surprisingly similar flavor. When power players are threatened or attacked, the official record often becomes a battleground. In the case of Becket, certain details were suppressed or manipulated to control public perception, and the ultimate truth about who precisely ordered the strike remained hazy for ages. With Frick, the parallels revolve around the immediate scramble to shape the narrative, ensuring the public never grasped how grave his condition really was. Another parallel that sometimes arises is the scandal connected to a certain wealthy oil figure from an entirely separate era, whose family faced a suspicious murder-suicide that was largely kept from public scrutiny. Just like with Frick, significant resources went into containing rumors and guiding the press away from more lurid interpretations. While each case stands on its own, there's a consistent pattern. The more power and wealth at stake, the more urgent the drive to control the flow of information. For Frick, controlling that information was key to preserving both his personal reputation and the wider structure he helped helm. The cover-up arguably succeeded. Many casual observers, if they've heard about Berkman's attack at all, assume it was a minor incident. Frick was shot but shrugged it off, perhaps taking a brief rest before returning to the office. The deeper reality that the bullets came alarmingly close to ending his life has been overshadowed by the simpler narrative. That overshadowing might be precisely what Frick intended. He went on to live many more years, continuing to shape significant business ventures and philanthropic projects. In diaries and personal letters from acquaintances, some of which have surfaced in library archives, there are references to how lucky Frick was to survive. Yet even these private notes rarely capture the full scope of what doctors presumably saw when they examined him after the attack. Helen Frick's secret art forgeries. Imagine standing in the grand entrance hall of a sumptuous New York mansion, surrounded by polished marble floors that gleam under the glow of opulent chandeliers. Everywhere you look, timeless works of art greet you. Paintings attributed to Rembrandt, Vermeer, Bellini, and Holbein hang in stately arrangement. Gilded frames catch the light, and the whole place smells faintly of well-preserved oil paint and centuries-old varnish. This is the famed Frick collection, a jewel in the cultural crown of Manhattan. It's said to contain some of the finest European masterpieces ever assembled under one roof, carefully curated by the formidable family whose name it bears. Yet whispers persist, whispers suggesting that hidden among these revered canvases might be a few pieces of questionable authenticity. Specifically, rumors point toward Helen Clay Frick, the only surviving daughter of industrial titan Henry Clay Frick, as having dabbled in the shadows of the art world to fill in gaps in her father's precious gallery. Helen Clay Frick was no ordinary heiress. Born into wealth thanks to her father's dominion over steel and coke production in the late 19th century, she enjoyed a life that mingled intellectual pursuits with luxurious indulgence. The Frick family, like many Gilded Age magnates, ventured into art collecting partly as a statement of cultural sophistication. Henry Clay Frick himself laid the foundation, acquiring formidable works from European old masters. Over time, the collection expanded and evolved, eventually becoming a preeminent cultural institution that has endured to this day. Nevertheless, behind the marbled halls and hushed reverence, an intriguing rumor has persisted for decades that in the 1920s, Helen Clay Frick may have taken clandestine steps to secure new old masters when genuine works proved too scarce or too expensive. Accounts of these alleged forgeries vary, but they often begin with a practical conundrum. By the early 20th century, many of the greatest European paintings were already locked away in major public museums or the private vaults of other tycoons. Securing a genuine Rembrandt, Van Dyck, or Gainsborough was becoming increasingly difficult, not to mention astronomically costly. So the story goes that Helen, determined to maintain her father's legacy and elevate the Frick collection into a comprehensive survey of Western art, might have turned to discreet intermediaries who specialized in authenticating spurious art. By filling the occasional gap in the collection with carefully executed forgeries, Helen could advance a grand narrative that the Frick collection was not just a display of wonderful pieces, but a sweeping representation of European artistic achievement. This speculation about Helen's role in possibly commissioning forgeries is grounded in the broader context of her personality. From an early age, she was known for her single-minded devotion to preserving her father's reputation. While Henry Clay Frick was still alive, she observed how he navigated the art world, dealing with top-tier dealers, curators, and experts. After his death in 1919, she inherited not just a share of his fortune, but also a sense of responsibility to protect and enhance the family's cultural inheritance. Researchers note that Helen funded historical preservation projects, donated generously to philanthropic causes, and poured enormous energy into shaping the Frick collection's future. She was meticulous, sometimes to a fault, about how the collection was displayed. One historian recounts that she fussed over lighting conditions, insisted on precise hanging heights for paintings, and even vetoed certain restoration decisions that might detract from the work's authentic aura. It's this zeal, some argue, that could have driven her to dabble in the gray market of art. Consider the atmosphere of the 1920s. Europe was still reeling from the First World War. Art markets were in flux, with economic pressures forcing certain estates to part with family heirlooms. Simultaneously, forgers found a lucrative niche, catering to collectors eager to bolster their holdings. With enough skill and cunning, a talented forger might replicate a 16th or 17th century style, artificially age the canvas, replicate crack patterns in the paint, and craft a plausible paper trail or provenance. If done well, these illusions could remain undetected for years. And in an era before modern technologies like infrared reflectography and pigment analysis were routinely applied, the best fakes could pass muster under cursory inspections. Skeptics of the Helen forgery theory maintain that there's little hard evidence to prove she procured counterfeit artworks. After all, no document has surfaced in which Helen explicitly instructs an agent to produce or acquire a forgery, nor has any major painting in the Frick collection been definitively discredited as fake. The official stance of the institution has always been one of cautious denial, pointing to thorough provenance research and the expertise of established art historians. However, that same official stance leaves room for speculation. The Frick archives, containing letters and invoices related to acquisitions, are known to have certain gaps, periods where the records are incomplete or details about a painting's previous ownership seem oddly vague. One angle that intrigues researchers is the parallel between Helen's rumored efforts and the deals arranged by influential art figures of her time. One such figure, the artist and patron Lilla Cabot Perry, navigated the international art scene with a flair that occasionally raised eyebrows. While Perry was not an outright forger herself, she famously facilitated negotiations between wealthy Americans and lesser-known French painters, sometimes blurring lines about authenticity or authorship. Art market enthusiasts see a pattern. High society patrons occasionally look the other way. When a painting's origin story was uncertain, as long as it looked convincing and matched the prestige desired. Could Helen have adopted a similar approach, especially when it came to lesser-known old masters or lesser-studied corners of the European canon? Rumors about forged pieces in elite collections aren't limited to the Fricks. In fact, the art world has witnessed plenty of similar controversies. One well-documented scandal involved a major foundation that discovered several of its prized old masters were actually modern forgeries. One perpetrator is believed to have used centuries-old wooden panels salvaged from dilapidated buildings to make his handiwork more convincing. In another famed fiasco, a prominent Guggenheim heir was conned into buying a series of fraudulent impressionist works. Even the legendary shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis faced gossip about lavish extravagances on his yacht, some of which allegedly involved questionable artworks displayed for the amazement of high-profile guests. Within that broader tapestry of deception, the Helen Frick story fits in neatly. A wealthy individual in the 1920s, driven by a desire to cultivate an image of cultural depth, might well have resorted to under-the-table solutions. Then there's the matter of concealment, which many find plausible in a figure of Helen's stature. Should a painting in the Frick collection be outed as fraudulent, not only would the institution's prestige suffer, but Helen's personal legacy could be tarnished. She was, after all, the caretaker of her father's dream. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Frick name had become synonymous with philanthropic impact and high cultural standards. Art historians who subscribe to these theories suggest that if any questionable piece were ever identified, Helen might have quietly removed it from public display or relegated it to storage, thus sparing the collection and herself the shame of a public scandal. A few diaries, seldom referenced in mainstream narratives, hint at Helen's private anxieties about the collection's completeness. One line from an acquaintance's diary remarks that Helen once confided in them about ensuring every era of painting is properly represented, complaining that too many prime examples were locked away in Europe's national museums. Scholars interpret this as a clue that she felt intense pressure to meet a near-impossible standard, a comprehensive overview of art history within the Frick Mansion's walls. With limited genuine works on the market, the path to that completeness may have been narrower than she was willing to admit, and where legitimate options narrow, unscrupulous dealers can appear. Frick's secret land, Grab's Henry Clay Frick was methodically buying up land parcel by parcel with one overriding aim: to build a coke empire that would propel him to extraordinary wealth. If you believe the official story told by his admirers, it was a straightforward case of business ambition meeting opportunity. But for those who scrutinize the details, it's hard to overlook the suggestion that Frick's so-called acquisitions were anything but fair. Local lore and historical sources describe families pushed to sell at prices well below the market rate, farmers suddenly uprooted from ancestral lands, and plenty of backroom dealings that never made the newspapers. To truly understand the scope of what happened, we need to look at the context of Western Pennsylvania in that era. Coal and coke production were fast becoming the lifeblood of American industry, coke being a vital fuel for steelmaking, especially in Pittsburgh's mills. Under these conditions, the Connellsville region, rich in coal seams, became a prime target for resource-hungry entrepreneurs. Frick, still in his 20s, recognized that controlling the supply of coke would grant him the kind of leverage few competitors could match. So he set his sights on buying up every bit of land that contained these precious seams. One account describes how seemingly mild-mannered negotiators would show up at farmhouse doors, offering deals that sounded fair on the surface, but left many families uneasy. These farmers were often uneducated in big business tactics, unfamiliar with how to gauge the true value of their mineral rights. In some cases, the threat of losing everything if they refused to sell loomed large. According to local reminiscences, a refusal might mean being cut off from vital business connections or railroad lines, networks that Frick himself was beginning to influence. As a result, owners felt cornered, capitulating to offers they deemed too low but saw as their only viable option. Handshakes would seal the deal, and soon the farmland passed into Frick's control at a fraction of its potential worth. Many of the property transfers were laundered through shell companies or associates, making it hard to trace Frick's influence directly at first glance. Deed records show a flurry of activity in specific years, with multiple plots consolidating under new ownership within a remarkably short period. Observers at the time suspected something bigger was at play, that someone was orchestrating a systematic buyout of Connellsville's prime coal deposits. It wasn't until Frick's operations became more public and until the enormous success of his coke enterprises drew media attention that people realized he had practically cornered the region's most lucrative resources. Modern historians love to draw parallels between Frick's tactics and those of other business titans who thrived on aggressive and sometimes ethically questionable acquisitions. Certain scholars compare Frick's land deals to how a major financier profited during a financial crisis in the early 1900s, buying assets cheaply when owners were most vulnerable. Others reference the underhanded deals pulled off by wealthy families involved in smuggling or bribery south of the border, parallels that emphasize how fast-track fortunes often come with shadows. Granted, every situation differs in its specifics, but the pattern is familiar. A powerful or up-and-coming magnate uses a blend of intimidation, strategic alliances, and leverage over local infrastructures to secure control of valuable assets. Yet there's a catch. While the documentary record supports the fact that Frick acquired vast landholdings in Connellsville at suspiciously low prices, proving outright coercion is trickier. The families involved rarely left behind official complaints. In many cases, they lacked the means or awareness to engage in lengthy legal battles. Records of those who sold might show a nominal payment and perhaps a deed of transfer, but not the behind-the-scenes pressure that led them to sign. So the notion of forced or coercive transactions is sometimes implied rather than spelled out. Oral histories passed down in local communities do note resentments and claims of strong arming, but as with most oral accounts, they're difficult to verify definitively. One especially telling anecdote describes a farmer who initially refused to sell, only to find that key access roads to his property were suddenly blocked or rerouted. Mysteriously, local officials didn't intervene. A few months later, under financial duress, he agreed to sell at a reduced price. Another story recounts how one family discovered only after finalizing the sale that the parcel under negotiation contained a far richer coal seam than reported. Without skilled surveyors of their own, they'd been reliant on Frick's evaluation, and Frick's representatives, it seems, hadn't disclosed the full picture. Though there are no smoking gun documents confirming these narratives, multiple local sources converge on such tales, weaving an image of systematic manipulation. Such actions mirror the tactics used by other powerful figures seeking quick, massive gains. A few short decades later, for example, some oil barons operating abroad did something similar, using bribes and political favors to secure drilling rights for less than their real value. Some unscrupulous shipping magnates used hidden ownership structures to skirt regulations and exploit local economies. Whenever vast riches were at stake, be it oil, minerals, or strategic territory, shady deals flourished. Frick's situation is reminiscent of those episodes. Identify a commodity poised to skyrocket in value, acquire it at bargain basement prices by hook or crook, then watch profits roll in. The repercussions for the Connellsville region were profound. What had once been a patchwork of modest family farms evolved into a network of coke ovens, belching smoke around the clock. The countryside transformed into an industrial corridor feeding Pittsburgh's steel mills. Those who sold, meanwhile, often relocated or became wage laborers in the expanding mining and coke operations. Local newspapers from that time occasionally lamented the loss of the old Connellsville, replaced by the roar of industry and an influx of workers seeking jobs in the new plants. Some who had sold their land at low prices regretted it deeply once they realized how valuable the property became under Frick's management. A few tried to protest that they'd been misled, but there was little appetite among local authorities or courts to challenge the man whose enterprise was bringing so much economic activity to the area. Henry Clay Frick's meteoric rise in business circles was thus fueled by these land deals. By the early 1880s, He controlled the lion's share of coking capacity around Connellsville, earning a reputation as the Coke King. That leverage opened doors to partnerships with titans in the steel industry. Before long, he was a cornerstone in building the steel empire that helped reshape America's industrial landscape. It's no exaggeration to say that the low-cost land he amassed in his youth laid the foundation for a fortune that would bankroll everything from grand mansions to philanthropic endeavors. Ironically, the genteel splendor of his New York residence and the celebrated art collection he curated were financed in part by land deals that critics argue were anything but gentlemanly. Critics who highlight this aspect of Frick's legacy see it as a case study in how fortunes of the Gilded Age often rested on shaky moral ground. They argue that the free market narrative championed by industrialists glossed over the real social costs of their deals. The families displaced by lowball offers may not have been forced out at gunpoint, but they certainly weren't dealing from a position of power. And once the local land shifted under Frick's control, its new owners reaped windfall profits, while the original residents had to uproot their lives for a pittance. Over time, these critiques came to echo in broader conversations about wealth inequality, the ethics of rapid industrialization, and the limited legal protections for small property holders confronted by massive corporate interests. Adelaide Frick's hidden mental health struggles. Among these family members is a figure often relegated to the background, Adelaide Childs Frick. While her husband, Henry Clay Frick, commanded headlines for his industrial empire and imposing presence, Adelaide remained comparatively discreet, her personal battles seldom addressed beyond the occasional whisper. Yet for those who pay closer attention, a sobering question emerges. Did Adelaide silently endure mental health struggles, especially in the wake of two devastating losses? Some accounts and personal recollections suggest she did, going so far as to seek treatment in private facilities, shielded from the public eye by a family anxious to preserve its pristine reputation. To understand the magnitude of Adelaide's struggle, you first have to see her life in context. Married into one of America's wealthiest industrial dynasties, she was expected to uphold an image of refined elegance, graceful at social functions, philanthropic in the community, and unwavering by her husband's side. Women of her status in that era were under immense scrutiny. Newspapers, gossip columns, and social registries recorded every ball gown they wore, every charitable event they hosted, and every interpersonal slight that might register in the upper-class sphere. Within this environment, the notion of openly grappling with depression or admitting oneself to a sanatorium would have been unthinkable. Such an admission could tarnish the family's carefully curated status, fueling rumors that might unsettle business partners, social allies, and the philanthropic circle on which the Fricks prided themselves. Adelaide's heartbreak was, by most accounts, a defining moment in her life. She bore multiple children, but two of them, Martha, born in 1891, and Henry Jr., born in 1892, tragically died in infancy. In an age of limited medical advancement, childhood mortality was sadly common, yet it didn't lessen the emotional shock for families. While outwardly stoic in the manner of many society women, Adelaide was said to have been deeply shattered by these losses. According to references in certain historical works, her grief spiraled into a prolonged depression, one that demanded care far beyond what domestic staff and conventional rest could provide. The story goes that Adelaide quietly retreated to private facilities, sometimes referred to as sanatoriums, where she could convalesce under conditions of anonymity. Official records are scarce, but a handful of private letters and personal recollections allude to her extended absences from the social scene and her family's concerted effort to keep those absences under wraps. The secretive approach to mental health was not unique to Adelaide. In the same era, notable figures from other illustrious families wrestled with psychological burdens in complete secrecy. Society at the turn of the century offered little empathy for mental illness, which often carried a stigma that could derail marriages, business fortunes, and social standing. A prominent heiress, for instance, might vanish from the public eye for months, with rumors swirling of nervous exhaustion or a rest cure, coded language to mask serious emotional distress. High society columns sometimes couch these episodes in euphemisms, painting them as sojourns to remote spas or lengthy ocean cruises, when in fact the individual could be undergoing psychiatric treatment. It was within this stifling context that Adelaide's struggles were apparently confined to back rooms and hidden corridors, ensuring that few beyond the immediate family had any inkling of her condition. Some genealogical researchers trying to piece together Adelaide's life have speculated that her experience parallels that of other well-known figures who faced personal anguish behind the scenes. They point to occasional references in diaries or family letters that mention her being unwell for extended stretches. The timing of these references sometimes lines up suspiciously well with her children's deaths, suggesting a causal link between her grief and her withdrawal from public life. One anecdote describes visitors to the Frick mansion being gently informed that Mrs. Frick is indisposed, as staff escorted them toward a different wing of the house for tea with other family members. If these accounts are accurate, Adelaide's convalescence in sanatoriums or private medical facilities may have been arranged precisely to keep such disruptions to a minimum. The idea of heartbreak-induced psychological distress resonates with modern understandings of depression, particularly postpartum depression or grief disorders. But in Adelaide's lifetime, such conditions were scarcely recognized by medicine as we understand them today. Women facing deep sadness were often diagnosed with hysteria or melancholia, terms that hardly encompass the pain of losing a child or the subsequent guilt some mothers felt, as if they had failed in their maternal role. Treatments commonly involved isolation, bland diets, strict bed rest, and minimal mental stimulation, a regimen that might do more to exacerbate a patient's sense of loneliness than to help them heal. Some private facilities did offer more compassionate care, but they were far from the norm, especially in an era when the mental health profession lacked the robust research and tools we see today. For someone of Adelaide's wealth, the environment might have been plush, beautiful gardens, private rooms, a staff of polite attendants, but the underlying principle remained one of gentle seclusion, away from prying eyes. The family had compelling reasons to keep her condition hush-hush. Henry Clay Frick was busy building business alliances and forging a fearsome reputation as one of the steel and coke magnates of the Gilded Age. Reporters who sniffed out any sign of weakness could tarnish his veneer of control, not only personally, but also professionally. Moreover, the philanthropic dimension of the Fricks demanded a carefully curated image of benevolence and unassailable prestige. If newspapers discovered that Adelaide was wrestling with mental anguish, perhaps to the point of needing months in a private treatment center, the swirling chatter might overshadow the family's charitable deeds or art patronage. In that environment, safeguarding Adelaide's privacy wasn't merely about compassion. It was also about strategic image management. A relative once recounted that Adelaide's demeanor changed noticeably after her children's deaths. Gone was the light-hearted hostess who once delighted in musical evenings and small gatherings. Instead, she grew more introspective, sometimes absently staring out of a window for long stretches. She developed a habit of retreating to her private quarters earlier than expected during social events, leaving guests to make polite conversation without her presence. On especially quiet nights, staff members recalled hearing her pacing the hallways or playing melancholy tunes on the piano. There was no public meltdown, no sensational scandal, but the undercurrent of sadness was palpable enough for those in her immediate circle to recognize it. In comparing Adelaide's plight to other cases, references emerge to well-known philanthropic families who, likewise, concealed private agony. One philanthropic heir, recognized for massive donations to cultural institutions, is rumored to have struggled with severe emotional trauma, seeking discreet psychiatric help throughout his adult life. Another socially prominent figure faced rumors of a same-sex relationship that fueled speculation about her mental well-being, yet her family worked tirelessly to ensure the gossip never blossomed into a public scandal. Meanwhile, even a First Lady and Amy